The morning air above Saipan hung thick with smoke on the 20th of June, 1944. Commander Jisaburo Ozawa stood on the bridge of the carrier Taiho, watching the horizon through binoculars that revealed nothing but empty sky where his aircraft should have been returning. In the span of 8 hours, 400 Japanese naval aircraft had launched against the American Task Force 58. By sunset, only 100 would limp back to their carriers, many so damaged they would never fly again. The Americans called it the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. The Japanese called it something else, the moment they began to understand the terrible arithmetic of American production. But this story is not about that single day. It is about a much larger miscalculation, one that would expose the Japanese home islands to devastation and reveal an industrial disparity so vast it would reshape modern warfare. The question that haunted Japanese military planners by late 1944 was simple and terrifying. How had American aircraft seemingly multiplied in the sky like a biblical plague? Where Japanese intelligence had estimated manageable numbers, reality delivered an avalanche of aluminum and steel that would darken their skies for the final year of the war. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The roots of Japanese miscalculations stretched back to 1941, when Imperial General Headquarters made their fateful decision to strike Pearl Harbor. Japanese intelligence services, though capable in certain respects, operated under profound institutional limitations. The Imperial Japanese Army General Staff Intelligence Section entered World War II with just 20 officers and 20 enlisted men focused primarily on Soviet intentions, not American industrial capacity. The Imperial Japanese Navy, despite its operational prowess, considered intelligence a secondary function. Collection was adequate, dissemination was poor, and most critically, operations divisions often ignored intelligence that threatened their assumptions. Yet in those early months of 1942 and 1943, Japanese intelligence estimates of American aircraft production were remarkably accurate. They knew what American aviation strength looked like in 1941. They correctly estimated increases through the end of 1943. Their projections aligned almost exactly with actual American production figures for that period. But knowing the numbers and understanding their implications proved to be vastly different things. Japanese planners could count aircraft. What they failed to comprehend was the exponential acceleration of American industrial mobilization and the strategic consequences of that acceleration. In May 1940, President Franklin Roosevelt stood before Congress and made what seemed like an absurd proclamation. America would produce 185,000 aircraft in 2 years. When Adolf Hitler's advisors briefed him on this announcement, they assured the Führer it was nothing but American propaganda. In 1939, annual aircraft production for the United States military totaled less than 3,000 planes. How could a nation still climbing out of the Great Depression, with unemployment lingering near 14%, possibly multiply its production 60-fold in 24 months? The Japanese military leadership shared Hitler's skepticism. Their strategic planning rested on several interconnected assumptions. First, that American industrial might, while substantial, could not be mobilized quickly enough to matter in a swift Pacific campaign. Second, that Japanese fighting spirit and tactical superiority would compensate for any material disadvantage. Third, and most fatally, that the sheer distance of the Pacific and the defensive perimeter Japan would establish would render American production capacity strategically irrelevant. A factory in Michigan could build all the bombers it wanted. Those bombers still had to cross 6,000 miles of ocean to reach targets that mattered. These assumptions were not baseless fantasies. Japan's military successes in China and the stunning early victories across the Pacific in 1942 seemed to validate them. Japanese forces had conquered an empire in 6 months. Singapore fell. The Philippines fell. The Dutch East Indies fell. By mid-1942, Japan controlled territory stretching from the Indian Ocean to the Central Pacific, encompassing resources that should have sustained a long war. Oil from the East Indies, rubber from Indochina, rice from Southeast Asia, all feeding the insatiable appetite of total war. But beneath these victories, economic realities told a darker story that Japanese planners either could not or would not acknowledge. Japan's gross domestic product in 1941 stood at approximately $200 billion. America exceeded $1 trillion. Japan produces 6 million tons of steel annually. America produced 75 million tons. Japan's entire industrial workforce numbered 6 million. America had mobilized 12 million industrial workers by 1943, with millions more women entering factories as men shipped overseas. These were not marginal differences. They were existential gulfs. The Japanese aircraft industry in 1939 produced 306 airframes per month, a respectable figure for a nation Japan's size. Through extraordinary effort and the expansion of supplier networks organized by companies like Mitsubishi Heavy Industries, monthly production climbed to 2,541 airframes by May 1944. Japanese engineers and factory workers achieved what could genuinely be called a production miracle. Employment in the aircraft industry grew from negligible pre-war numbers to 1.5 million workers by war's end. New factories rose across the home islands. Supplier networks extended into thousands of small workshops. The industry transformed from a cottage enterprise into a genuine war machine. And yet, America's transformation occurred on a scale that defied comprehension. In 1941, American factories produced more than 3 million vehicles, one every 69 seconds, rolling off Ford's assembly lines in Michigan. In 1944 alone, American industry built more aircraft than Japan would produce in the entire 6 years of war combined. Let that sink in. 1 year of American production exceeded 6 years of Japanese output, and these were not equivalent aircraft. American production included 97,810 multi-engine bombers, massive 4-engine strategic bombers like the B-29 Superfortress, capable of carrying 4 tons of ordnance across 1,500 miles. Japan's entire wartime production included just 15,117 bombers, all twin-engine varieties with a fraction of the payload and range. If one measured production not in number of aircraft but in total engines produced, total weight of airframes, or total bomb-carrying capacity, the disparity grew even more pronounced. American factories were not just building more planes. They were building bigger, more complex, more capable weapons platforms at a pace that would have seemed like science fiction a decade earlier. The Boeing B-29 Superfortress epitomized this transformation. The aircraft first flew in September 1942. Within 2 years, hundreds were operational across the Pacific. The B-29 was the largest combat aircraft of World War II, with a maximum bomb load that dwarfed anything in the Japanese arsenal. It featured a pressurized cabin, allowing crews to operate in relative comfort at 30,000 feet altitudes, where most Japanese fighters struggled to intercept. Remote-controlled gun turrets, long-range capability of more than 3,000 miles, and most critically, the ability to reach the Japanese home islands from newly captured bases in the Mariana Islands. Japanese aviation development followed a different trajectory. The Mitsubishi A6M0 fighter had been a brilliant design in 1940, combining exceptional range with maneuverability that outclassed early war American fighters. But Japan's industry largely relied on Zero variants throughout the war, making incremental improvements to an aging platform. By late 1943, new American designs like the F-6F Hellcat and F-4U Corsair had surpassed the Zero in virtually every performance metric: speed, armor, firepower, survivability, and American factories were churning out these superior aircraft by the thousands. The institutional structure of Japanese aviation compounded these problems. The Imperial Japanese Army and Imperial Japanese Navy each maintained separate air forces with distinct aircraft designs, separate factories, and zero standardization. Army and Navy aircraft manufacturers acted like competitors rather than allies. They used different electrical systems, different fasteners, different measurement standards. The Navy developed the superb Zero fighter. The Army, refusing to accept Navy designs, developed the Ki-43 Hayabusa. Both were excellent aircraft, but building two separate types meant neither achieved the economies of scale that mass production could provide. Had the services cooperated, Japan might have concentrated resources on fewer, better-developed designs produced in greater numbers. Instead, duplication of effort hemorrhaged scarce resources. This inter-service rivalry extended beyond hardware into intelligence and operations. When U.S. Marines landed on Guadalcanal in August 1942, Army General Staff officers in Tokyo did not initially know where Guadalcanal was located, much less that the Navy had established a base there. The Navy did not inform the Army about the catastrophic defeat at Midway until 1945, 3 years after 4 irreplaceable fleet carriers went to the bottom in a single day. Such information blackouts crippled strategic planning. How could Japan prosecute a coordinated war when its own services treated each other like foreign powers? By mid-1943, the material and qualitative advantages were beginning to manifest in ways Japanese commanders could not ignore. The campaign in the Solomon Islands devolved into a meat grinder of attrition that Japan could not win. Every downed zero represented not just a lost aircraft, but a dead pilot, because Japan's training pipeline could not replace experienced aviators at anything approaching the rate they were being killed. American pilots rotated home after completing tours. They trained new generations of aviators, passing on hard-won combat lessons. Japanese pilots flew until they died. Experience literally went to the bottom of the Pacific with each shot-down aircraft. American logistics created another insurmountable advantage. The United States Navy deployed 847 anti-submarine vessels during the war. Japan, an island empire utterly dependent on maritime commerce, managed to build just 63 destroyers and a relative handful of escort vessels. American submarines strangled Japanese supply lines with devastating efficiency. By late 1944, tankers carrying oil from the East Indies to Japan were being sunk faster than they could be replaced. Raw materials accumulated uselessly in conquered territories while factories in Japan sat idle for lack of resources. The empire Japan had conquered to secure strategic materials became a strategic liability as the distances grew impossible to defend. The Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944 marked not just a tactical defeat but a strategic revelation. American Task Force 58 sortied with 15 fleet carriers operating more than 900 aircraft. Japanese carrier aviation, once the finest in the world, could muster 400 planes, many flown by inadequately trained pilots, rushing through abbreviated training programs because fuel shortages limited flight hours. The result was massacre. American fighter pilots dubbed it the Marianas Turkey Shoot. Japanese aircraft fell in flames before many even reached their targets. 2 Japanese carriers went to the bottom. American losses were minimal. But the real catastrophe was not the loss of ships or planes. It was the mathematical reality that Commander Ozawa and his staff confronted in the aftermath. In the 3 years following Midway, Japan built 6 aircraft carriers. The United States built 17 fleet carriers, and that figure didn't include dozens of escort carriers. American shipyards launched more tonnage in 1941 alone than Japan would build during the entire war. And these weren't just numbers in intelligence reports. They were steel realities steaming across the Pacific. The first Boeing B-29 Superfortress to strike the Japanese home islands crossed the coastline of Kyushu on the night of June 15, 1944. 75 bombers had launched from forward bases in China as part of Operation Matterhorn. Only 47 managed to drop bombs anywhere near the primary target, the Imperial Iron and Steel Works at Yawata. 1 bomb struck close to the intended aim point. The steel works remained essentially unscathed, but the physical damage was irrelevant. What mattered was the message those bombers delivered. For the first time since the Doolittle raid, in April 1942, a pinprick attack launched from carriers that could not be sustained. American strategic bombers had reached the Japanese home islands. And unlike Doolittle's one-way mission, these raids represented the beginning of a campaign that would only intensify. Japanese civilians looking up at contrails scratching across their sky understood something their government had been desperately trying to conceal. The war was not going well. The Yawata raid was hailed in American newspapers as a great victory despite its minimal physical impact. Japanese propaganda attempted to downplay the attack, but the effort backfired. If a handful of bombers reaching Japan was insignificant, why was the government mentioning it at all? The cognitive dissonance spread through Japanese society like cracks in porcelain. Official pronouncements spoke of inevitable victory. Reality delivered burning buildings and air raid sirens. Operation Matterhorn, launched from bases in India with forward staging through China, proved logistically nightmarish. Every gallon of fuel, every bomb, every spare part had to be flown over the Himalayas, infamous hump route, where transport aircraft fought through some of the most treacherous flying conditions on Earth. For every gallon of fuel delivered to B-29 bases in China, multiple gallons were consumed by the transport aircraft making the delivery. The mathematics of supply made sustained operations nearly impossible. Between June 1944 and March 1945, XX Bomber Command conducted 49 raids from China and India, of which only 9 targeted the Japanese home islands. But mathematical impossibility had a way of becoming American reality. In June 1944, the same month as the Yawata raid, U.S. Marines stormed the beaches of Saipan in the Mariana Islands. Saipan fell by July 9th. Nearby, Tinian fell by August 1st, and Guam fell by August 10th. 3 islands, 1,500 miles south of Tokyo. Close enough. The capture of the Marianas was not simply a military victory. It was an engineering catalyst. Naval construction. Battalions, the famous Seabees, along with Army Air Force engineers, descended on these volcanic islands and transformed them into the largest air bases on Earth. The jungle was bulldozed. Coral was crushed and spread. 9,000-foot runways of reinforced concrete stretched across islands that weeks earlier had been Japanese strongholds. By October 20th, 1944, Brigadier General Haywood Hansell arrived on Saipan in the first B-29 to reach the islands. Within weeks, Tinian would host 6 miles of taxiways linking hardstands to multiple runways capable of accommodating over 200 B-29s. The first mission from the Marianas launched on November 24, 1944. 111 B-29s, led by Brigadier General Emmett O'Donnell Jr., targeted an aircraft engine plant on the outskirts of Tokyo. Bad weather hampered the raid. Only 24 bombers struck the primary target. 64 others dropped there. Payloads on docks and urban areas. Japanese fighters managed to down 1 B-29. The bombing results were unimpressive. But General Henry Hap Arnold, commanding general of the Army Air Forces, did not need impressive results from individual raids. He needed sustained pressure. He needed the Japanese people and government to understand that American bombers could reach them anytime, anywhere, in any weather, in numbers that would only grow. The psychological calculation was straightforward. Every raid that didn't achieve precise bombing, results still achieved strategic impact by demonstrating reach and persistence. Between October 1944 and January 1945, XXI Bomber Command struck aircraft factories, engine plants, and industrial facilities across Japan. Mechanical difficulties plagued the raids. The B-29, despite being the most advanced bomber of its era, was also the most complex aircraft yet produced, and teething problems persisted. Weather over Japan proved worse than anticipated. High-altitude winds, later identified as the jet stream, a meteorological phenomenon not yet fully understood, carried bombs far off target. Japanese air defenses, while gradually being overwhelmed, still extracted casualties. Japanese fighter strength in the home islands had been increased to 375 aircraft assigned to air defense divisions by October 1944. But this represented a fraction of the aircraft Japan desperately needed for offensive operations across the shrinking perimeter of its empire. Every fighter defending Tokyo was a fighter not available for the Philippines, not available for Iwo Jima, not available for Okinawa. The strategic calculus tightened like a noose. Defend everything adequately? Impossible. Prioritize the home islands? then the perimeter collapses faster. Prioritize the perimeter, then American bombers operate with impunity over Japan. By late December 1944, Imperial General Headquarters confronted a reality that no amount of fighting spirit could obscure. The ambitious programs for aircraft and ship production remained unachieved. The absolute national defense line, the perimeter that was supposed to be impregnable, had been penetrated. American forces were not merely advancing, they were accelerating, and the numbers were becoming undeniable. Consider the arithmetic that Japanese intelligence analysts laid before their superiors in early 1945. American aircraft production in 1944 had exceeded 96,000 planes. 96,000. In a single year, Japan's total production from 1940 through 1945 would not reach 76,000 aircraft. 1 year of American output exceeded Japan's entire 6-year war production, and these weren't just numbers. They translated into formations of hundreds of bombers appearing over Japanese cities with increasing regularity. In January 1945, General Curtis LeMay arrived to take command of XXI Bomber Command, replacing General Hansel. LeMay had earned his reputation leading bomber formations over Germany, where he pioneered new tactics and pushed for maximum effectiveness regardless of cost. General Arnold gave LeMay clear instructions. Get results. The strategic bombing campaign needed to prove its value, needed to demonstrate that Japan could be brought to its knees by air power alone, potentially obviating the need for a bloody invasion of the home islands. LeMay studied the problem with the cold, analytical mind of an engineer evaluating a broken system. High-altitude precision bombing was not working. The jet stream scattered bombs. Cloud cover obscured targets. Bomb damage assessment showed minimal industrial disruption. Japan's war production, dispersed across thousands of small workshops and cottage industries embedded in residential areas, proved remarkably resilient to precision attacks against large factories. Destroying a major plant might delay production by days, but the small workshops kept functioning. In early February 1945, LeMay authorized an experimental raid on Kobe using incendiary munitions. The results caught his attention. Then, on February 25, 174 B-29s conducted a high-altitude incendiary raid on Tokyo during daylight hours, destroying approximately 643 acres of the city. The wooden and paper construction of Japanese cities, efficient for earthquake resilience, catastrophic under incendiary attack, burned with terrifying efficiency. LeMay made a radical decision. He would strip defensive guns, except tail turrets, from his B-29s, reducing aircraft weight and allowing them to carry more ordnance. He would attack at night, at low altitude between 5,000 and 7,000 feet, where accuracy improved and Japanese air defenses struggled to intercept in darkness. And he would use incendiaries exclusively, creating firestorms that would consume not just military targets, but entire sections of urban areas where Japan's dispersed war industry resided. On the night of March 9th through 10th, 1945, Operation Meeting House unfolded over Tokyo. 334 B-29s followed Pathfinder aircraft that marked the target, the Shitamachi neighborhood, a densely populated area of wooden structures housing both civilians and countless small workshops feeding Japan's war machine. 279 bombers successfully dropped 1,665 tons of incendiaries, including 500,000 cylinders of napalm and white phosphorus. What happened next exceeded even LeMay's expectations. Dry conditions and strong winds transformed individual fires into a conflagration. The conflagration became a firestorm. Temperatures in the firestorm's center reached 1,800 degrees Fahrenheit. The superheated air created hurricane-force winds that sucked oxygen from bomb shelters, suffocating those who had sought safety underground. Canals boiled, metal melted. 16 square miles of central Tokyo, home to over 1 million people, was incinerated. The death toll from Operation Meeting House has been estimated at approximately 100,000 people, making it the single most destructive air raid in human history, more deadly than either atomic bombing that would follow in August. American military analysts who conducted post-raid damage assessment struggled to comprehend the scale of destruction. Reconnaissance photographs showed vast sections of one of the world's great cities reduced to ash and twisted metal. 25% of Tokyo's structures, 267,000 buildings, had simply ceased to exist. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Japanese civilians who survived emerged into a landscape that resembled medieval visions of hell. Bodies were stacked in canals and streets. Survivors wandered through ash fields where neighborhoods had stood hours earlier. The government's response alternated between denial and exhortations for greater sacrifice. Radio broadcasts proclaimed the need for fighting spirit, while citizens dug through rubble searching for family members. Operation Meeting House was not an isolated raid. It was a template. Over the following months, LeMay's bombers systematically incinerated Japanese cities. On March 11th and 12th, Nagoya was struck. On March 13th and 14th, Osaka burned. On March 16th and 17th, Kobe was devastated. The campaign continued through April and May, targeting every major urban center within B-29 range. Yokohama, Kawasaki, Nagoya again, Tokyo again. The bombers came in formations so large they blotted out stars. By mid-1945, XXI Bomber Command had grown to encompass 5 bomb wings: the 73rd Bomb Wing with 4 groups, the 313th Wing with 4 groups, the 314th Wing with 4 groups. The 58th Wing, originally based in China, now operates from Tinian with 4 groups. The 315th Wing with 4 groups flying specially modified B-29s equipped for night precision radar bombing of oil refineries and other specific targets. By summer 1945, the Marianas hosted over 1,000 B-29s, with more arriving weekly. The Japanese response grew increasingly desperate. Fighter production, which had reached 2,541 aircraft per month in May 1944, began declining as strategic bombing and the destruction of supplier networks degraded industrial capacity. An earthquake in December 1944 compounded the damage, disrupting the supply of Decembertica machinery parts that Mitsubishi's Nagoya Aircraft Works required. The carefully constructed supplier networks that had enabled Japan's production miracle became a vulnerability. Bombing a single supplier could cripple multiple assembly plants. In April 1945, Japan initiated Operation Ketsugo, the final defense plan for the home islands. The strategy assumed American invasion forces would land on Kyushu in late 1945, followed by an assault on Honshu. Japan mobilized every available resource for this final battle: 2,000 conventional aircraft, 10,000 kamikaze planes including training aircraft with wooden airframes that conventional radar struggled to detect, 1,300 suicide submarines, an unknown number of suicide divers with explosives strapped to their backs who would wait in shallows to swim out and destroy landing craft. Civilians were trained to fight with sharpened bamboo spears. The civilian population of Saipan, who had thrown themselves from cliffs rather than surrender, was held up as a model. But Operation Ketsugo represented a fantasy built on desperation rather than capability. The 10,000 kamikaze aircraft existed largely on paper. Fuel to fly them did not exist. American submarines had strangled the tanker traffic from the East Indies. Oil reserves dwindled toward zero. Pilots who had received abbreviated training due to fuel shortages would fly one-way missions in planes that might not reach their targets before running out of fuel. The strategic bombing campaign had achieved what precision attacks on factories could not. It had destroyed the urban infrastructure supporting dispersed war production. It had shattered transportation networks. It had consumed irreplaceable machine tools and killed irreplaceable skilled workers. Most significantly, it had broken the psychological compact between the Japanese government and its people. When your government cannot protect your home, when your city burns while officials speak of inevitable victory, belief erodes. By June 1945, Japan's cities were running out of targets worth bombing. LeMay testified to this reality when he informed his superiors that he expected to exhaust major urban targets by September. The air campaign was transitioning to tactical operations, attacking airfields on Kyushu to support the Okinawa campaign, laying mines in harbors and shipping channels to complete the maritime blockade, destroying specific military installations. Admiral Chester Nimitz later stated that the mining campaign accomplished phenomenal results, effectively completing the strategic blockade of an island nation. Airpower was demonstrating, for the first time in history, that it could bear the primary burden of strangling a major industrialized power. The Japanese merchant fleet, already decimated by submarines, found its survivors trapped in port or blown apart by aerial mines. Resources piled up in warehouses in Korea and China and Southeast Asia, while Japan starved. By July 1945, Japanese leadership confronted a choice between three apocalyptic scenarios. First, continue fighting, sacrifice millions in Operation Ketsugo, and face annihilation. Second, seek negotiated peace through Soviet mediation, a hope that would prove illusory when the Soviet Union declared war on Japan on August 8. Third, accept unconditional surrender and hope for mercy from an enemy with little reason to show it. The Supreme Council for the Direction of War, known as the Big Six, remained deadlocked. Army War Minister Korechika Anami insisted on fighting to the bitter end. Navy Minister Mitsumasa Yonai recognized the war was lost, but feared assassination if he advocated surrender too openly. Foreign Minister Shigenori Togo pushed for peace negotiations, but found little support. The institutional culture of the Japanese military made surrender incomprehensible. Officers who suggested negotiated peace risked not just professional ruin, but physical assassination. Between 1909 and 1936, 8 government and military leaders had been murdered by ultra-nationalist officers who viewed any compromise as treason. Then the arithmetic of destruction took on a new dimension. On August 6, 1945, a single B-29 named Enola Gay dropped a single bomb on Hiroshima. The atomic weapon detonated with the force of 16,000 tons of TNT, instantly vaporizing the city center and killing approximately 80,000 people outright, with tens of thousands more dying from radiation effects in subsequent weeks. 3 days later, on August 9th, a second atomic bomb destroyed Nagasaki. That same day, the Soviet Union, which Japan had desperately hoped would broker peace, instead declared war and invaded Manchuria with overwhelming force. The War Cabinet met to discuss surrender for the first time. Hardliners still resisted. They wanted not just preservation of the imperial system, but also terms that would prevent occupation, allow self-disarmament, and enable Japan to conduct its own war crimes trials. In other words, they wanted to avoid accountability while maintaining the structures that had led to war. Emperor Hirohito intervened twice on August 9th and August 14th to break deadlocks and force acceptance of Allied terms. On August 15th, Japanese citizens heard their emperor's voice for the first time in a radio broadcast announcing capitulation. He never used the word surrender. The carefully constructed euphemisms spoke of enduring the unendurable and accepting a situation that had developed not necessarily to Japan's advantage. The aftermath revealed the full scope of disparity. American industry had produced 297,000 aircraft during the war. Japan had produced 76,000. America built 141 aircraft carriers of all types. Japan built 17. America launched more vessels in 1941 alone than Japan built during the entire war. In 1944, American factories produced more aircraft than Japan manufactured from 1939 through 1945, 1 year versus 6 years. The arithmetic was merciless. But numbers alone do not capture the human cost of this miscalculation. Strategic bombing killed between 241,000 and 900,000 Japanese civilians, depending on which estimates are credited. Tokyo, Osaka, Nagoya, Kobe, Yokohama, Japan's great cities lay in ruins. Approximately 40% of urban areas in 66 cities had been incinerated. Millions were homeless. Infrastructure was shattered. The economy had collapsed. Rice harvests, already precarious, faced catastrophic shortfalls without imports. Post-war interrogations of Japanese officials revealed the depth of their miscalculation. Admiral Ozawa, who commanded the fleet at the Battle of the Philippine Sea, acknowledged that Japanese planning had fundamentally misunderstood American industrial capacity. The strategic concept that distance and defensive perimeters would nullify American production advantages had proven fatally flawed. American factories did not need to be near the battlefield. They needed to build weapons capable of crossing distance. The B-29 represented the solution to that equation. More broadly, Japanese leadership had committed the classic error of mirror imaging. They assumed America would fight as Japan would fight, accepting early losses, seeking decisive battle, negotiating peace when casualties mounted. Instead, America fought an industrial war of attrition that leveraged its overwhelming economic advantages. The United States could afford to lose battles because it could replace losses faster than Japan could inflict them. Japan could not afford to lose battles because every loss was irreplaceable. The strategic bombing campaign also represented a turning point in military history. Operation Meeting House and the subsequent incendiary raids demonstrated that aerial warfare could inflict devastation on a scale previously unimaginable. The atomic bombings amplified this reality to cosmic proportions. The distinction between military and civilian targets, already blurred by modern industrial war, effectively disappeared when entire cities became battlefields. Many American commanders, particularly Air Force officers, argued by May 1945 that Japan could be forced to surrender by air power alone, without invasion. Admiral King, Commander-in-Chief of the U.S. Navy, was so concerned about kamikaze casualties that he advocated for cancelling Operation Downfall, the planned invasion, in favor of continuing the blockade and bombing campaign. The atomic bombings and Soviet entry rendered the question moot, but the debate highlighted how thoroughly the air campaign had shifted strategic calculations. For Japan, the legacy extended beyond physical destruction into profound cultural trauma. A nation that had never been successfully invaded, that had built an ideology around martial invincibility, faced not just defeat but annihilation. The Emperor's August 15th broadcast shattered the myth of divine protection. Cities that had stood for centuries were ash. The industrial economy that had taken decades to build was rubble. Occupation by foreign forces, an unthinkable humiliation, became reality. Yet within this devastation lay the seeds of post-war transformation. The complete collapse of the old order created space for fundamental restructuring. American occupation authorities, led by General Douglas MacArthur, implemented reforms that would have been impossible without total defeat. The military was disbanded. The Zaibatsu industrial conglomerates that had fueled militarism were broken up. Democratic institutions were established. Most significantly, Article 9 of the new Constitution renounced war as a sovereign right. The economic resurrection of Japan in subsequent decades represented another kind of production miracle. The same organizational capabilities and work ethic that had built 76,000 warplanes were redirected toward consumer goods and industrial exports. By the 1980s, Japan had become the world's second-largest economy. Tokyo, incinerated in March 1945, grew into a gleaming metropolis of gleaming towers and advanced infrastructure. The transformation was so complete that younger generations struggled to imagine their grandparents' devastation. But the lessons of production disparity remained relevant. Military strategists studying the Pacific War consistently identified industrial capacity as the decisive factor. Superior fighting spirit, tactical innovation, and operational excellence could win battles. Sustained industrial production won wars. The United States demonstrated that a democracy with robust industrial infrastructure could mobilize resources on a scale that authoritarian systems could not match, despite the supposed efficiency of centralized control. The story also illustrated the danger of intelligence failures rooted in institutional culture. Japanese intelligence correctly assessed American production numbers through 1943, but intelligence must inform strategy to be useful. When operational commanders ignore intelligence that threatens their assumptions, as Japanese operations divisions repeatedly did, accurate information becomes worthless. The Navy's gross underestimation of American strength before Midway contributed to catastrophic defeat. The Army's dismissal of the Tarawa operation as a minor affair missed the launching point for the Central Pacific offensive. Intelligence without institutional mechanisms to act on it merely provides detailed knowledge of approaching disaster. The inter-service rivalry between the Imperial Japanese Army and Navy also offers enduring lessons. Duplication of effort, refusal to standardize equipment, withholding of information. These institutional pathologies wasted resources Japan could not afford to waste. The Army developed the Hayabusa fighter because it refused to accept the Navy's excellent Zero. Both services built separate aircraft with separate supply chains and separate training pipelines. Meanwhile, American industry was achieving economies of scale by producing standardized designs in massive quantities. Perhaps most significantly, the Pacific War demonstrated the limitations of tactical excellence without strategic viability. Japanese pilots in 1941 and 1942 were superbly trained professionals who dominated the skies in early engagements. Japanese torpedoes were superior to American torpedoes. Japanese night fighting doctrine was more developed. Japanese naval aviation tactics were innovative and effective. None of it mattered. Superior tactics cannot overcome a 10-to-1 production disadvantage sustained over years. Eventually, quantity becomes quality when the quantitative difference is large enough. The human dimension of this disparity deserves reflection. Japanese pilots flew until they died because the training pipeline could not replace them. American pilots rotated home to train new generations, creating a virtuous cycle where combat experience improved training, which improved combat performance. Japanese factory workers achieved extraordinary productivity increases through 1944 despite resource shortages and bombing. American factory workers achieved even greater productivity increases with abundant resources and industrial safety. The contrast was not moral or cultural, it was systemic and economic. Standing in Tokyo today, surrounded by prosperity and peace, it requires effort to imagine the smoking wasteland of August 1945. The trains run on time. The streets are clean. The economy hums with efficiency. But beneath the modernity lie the ashes of empire and the memory of miscalculation. The generation that witnessed the B-29s has largely passed away, taking their direct memories with them. What remains are lessons inscribed in history books and memorials scattered across the city. The central question how Japan misjudged American production capacity so catastrophically admits no simple answer. It was part intelligence failure, part institutional dysfunction, part cultural blindness, and part the inevitable friction of war, where initial assumptions harden into ideology despite contrary evidence. Japanese planners knew American factories were productive. They did not comprehend that productivity could scale exponentially when mobilized for total war. They measured American capacity by peacetime standards and Japanese fighting spirit by wartime intensity, creating a comparison that validated their desired conclusion. By the time B-29s began appearing over Japanese cities in formations of hundreds, the arithmetic was undeniable, but the war was unwinnable. Japan had estimated perhaps 12,000 American aircraft might threaten their home islands over the course of the war. The reality delivered 10 times that number, with 300,000 American aircraft produced by war's end. The disparity between estimate and reality was not a rounding error. It was a difference between survival and annihilation. The home islands, once thought invulnerable behind defensive perimeters and vast ocean distances, became the front line. Every major city felt the weight of American production translated into high explosive and incendiary bombs. The superiority of the Japanese fighting spirit, so central to pre-war military ideology, proved powerless against formations of superfortresses that could simply absorb losses and return the next night with more planes. Steel defeated spirit. Production defeated sacrifice. And a miscalculation about factories in Michigan and California led to firestorms over Tokyo and Osaka. In the final accounting, the Pacific War became a morality tale about the importance of accurate assessment and the dangers of believing one's own propaganda. When intelligence serves ideology rather than informing strategy, when institutional pride prevents adaptation, when cultural assumptions override mathematical reality, catastrophe follows. Japan learned this lesson at a cost measured in millions of lives and decades of suffering. The ruins of August 1945 stand as testament to what happens when the arithmetic of war is miscalculated on an industrial scale. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.